The BYU Cougars beat Kansas State, a Big 12 championship contender. Can they beat your team too? This is Locked On Big 12.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome into Locked On Big 12. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast, Locked On Big 12. Thank you for making this show your first listen every single day. On today's program, would your team lose to BYU? Are the Cougars suddenly a contender to win the Big 12 title? We'll also talk about how BYU pulled off that upset against Kansas State. And finally, the new Pac-12 just got Gonzaga. Is that bad for the Big 12? Joining us, Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars, talking all things BYU every day as a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you again for making these two shows your first listen every day. If you hit subscribe, we get to keep our jobs. Jake, off the top of the show, is BYU now a legitimate Big 12 championship contender, and should the rest of the conference look at them as a threat in football?
Contender, no. Threat, yes. Here's the deal. BYU's offense against Kansas State mustered 241 total yards. And that's kind of the big concern I have is BYU was the beneficiary of a lot of short fields because of the turnovers that Kansas State committed in that game. Now, BYU's defense set up their offense, and their offense cashed in. So you obviously you applaud that. But my bigger concern is, Drake, is this offense capable of going into a game, let's say this week against Baylor, where maybe they're even in the turnover margin? Can they sustain drives long enough to score points and score points in bunches that'll get them wins on the road in particular? Until they prove they can do that, I don't think they're a contender. But with the defense that they have, they're absolutely a threat to anybody on any given week.
What does it take if BYU is going to become a contender then? And even before that, Jake, for the BYU fans out there who heard that and said, no, wait, we're 4-0. Of course we're a contender. How do you talk those fans off the ledge, try to keep the hopes at an even level?
Well, there's hope, obviously, because Sione Moa, a star running back, kind of emerged on last Saturday night against Kansas State. He was the fifth-string running back coming into the season. Yeah. He emerged and really showed out. Now, if you get him and LJ Martin back, and the expectation that LJ will be back after the bye, that could be your 1-2 combo that could get the running game going for BYU. And if you can have a running game that can really pick up yards in chunks, well, that's going to make BYU's offense that much better, Drake, and that's going to sustain those drives, as I mentioned. There's a chance that BYU could become a contender, but they've got to get the pieces in place. And the trajectory for BYU's offense right now, it's looking up, but they've got to go out there and prove it. And I think the first test obviously comes Saturday against Baylor.
Analytics would show that 38-9 didn't tell the full story of this game against Kansas State. You always see that did we really get beat that bad graph. And this week, BYU was not a team that blew out Kansas State on paper, but it's that 2-ish minute mark in the first half where BYU is trailing 6-0, and then the 11-minute mark in the third quarter where BYU is winning 31-6. Was this a fluke, the win for BYU at home, or does it tell the true story of what the Cougars will be in 2024?
A lot of coaches will tell you that middle 8 minutes, so we're talking the final 4 minutes of the first half, the first 4 minutes of the second half, are where most games are won and lost. And BYU won that emphatically. You're right. They absolutely took advantage of this. The one thing I noticed, and I talked about this on Locked On Cougars, is that when that strip of the ball came out and the scoop and score for BYU for Tommy Prassis happened, you could tell Kansas State was a little flustered. Yep. That's when Jay Hill and the BYU defense turned up the pressure. Remember, that was a zone blitz that Tyler Batty dropped back into coverage. And I'm pretty sure that Avery Johnson came off the field after that interception and mouthed to his coach, or at least lip reading, said, I didn't see him. Yeah. That means that BYU designed the defense perfectly. Then when you have him rattled, you turn up the pressure even more. Early in the second half, they intercept him once again. He makes a bad decision to throw into the middle of the field, which Harrison Taggart picks off. BYU cashes in all three of those turnovers for 21 points, and that's all she wrote. So yeah, it was a fluky 8 minutes, but that's an important 8-minute stretch. It's more like 6 minutes of game time, but that stretch decided the game, and coaches will tell you that stretch will more often than not win football games.
Jake, we've gotten into the analytical breakdown of the game against Kansas State, which I was saving the middle segment for. What I want to get to in that segment then will be the rest of this schedule and how those teams should fare against BYU or how they should view BYU. Let's stick on this game for a second. From the scoop and score to the punt return to the pomp and circumstance of being at LaVell Edwards Stadium. Would you say, if this game's in Manhattan, that it does go vastly differently for BYU? How much did LES and those mistakes that LES creates play into this win?
I do think it goes different. Here's the deal. I think that Avery Johnson, it was his first ever road start against a Power 4 opponent. Mm-hmm. He played against Tulane earlier this year, and Yulman Stadium down there in New Orleans holds 30,000 people. And you could tell that they were pretty rattled by that crowd. They came to LaVell Edwards Stadium, and it was 64,000 and change was the official attendance, which is actually over capacity. It was standing room only in Provo. And you could tell that that crowd was in a frenzy. And BYU's offensive coordinator, Aaron Roderick, said on his Coordinator's Corner show this week that a Kansas State assistant told him they found it so loud. They were trying to get the dual headset, the mic, the whatever. Yeah. They tried to find some of those to use because they just couldn't hear. They didn't have enough of them to go around. That's how crazy this environment was. It was absolutely deafening inside LaVell Edwards Stadium, and BYU used that to their advantage. There's a whole theory about the vampire cougs about BYU, but when you come to Provo at night, crazy things happen, and it sure unfolded on Saturday night.
Jake, before we jump into how the rest of the schools on BYU schedule should view them, or even those who could play BYU in Arlington if the Cougars get that far, let's talk Baylor for a second. Okay. Will BYU look different going on the road after having such good, I'm going to call it home cooking, which has nothing to do with the officials or even the team, but just having 60,000 at LES behind you? It's going to be much different going into what will be likely a pretty quiet McLean Stadium. Does that throw off the Cougars?
It could a little bit, but I also think that BYU's played at Wyoming. They also played at SMU earlier this season, and they weren't capacity crowds at either one of those venues when they played there. So it doesn't have to be a capacity crowd for BYU to respond. Good. I think they have proven they can win on the road. I think that SMU game proves that BYU can grind out a result because they did not have their best offensive performance, and Jake Retzlaff probably had his worst performance of the season to date in that game, but they still found a way to win that football game. So, yeah, going to Baylor, they should take a lot of confidence going into this matchup, and we all know that the Bears are going to be absolutely desperate. Dave Aranda's coaching for his job at this point, and the way that they lost against Colorado is not going to leave a good taste in anybody's mouth down there in Waco.
Let's go into who should be scared of BYU, and is scared the right word. We'll do that next with the rest of the schedule and teams that might play them in Arlington if they go that far on Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by 5 Hour Energy. Thanks to BYU, I was up until 2:30 Eastern time this weekend. And then once the game was over, it's like, oh, well, I got to record a podcast. How do I do this? 5 Hour Energy. Grab a 5 Hour Energy shot to stay alert and watch all your favorite games, even when BYU plays until 2 o'clock Eastern time. With zero sugar, convenient portable size, it's the perfect pick-me-up to get stuff done. 5 Hour Energy website has flavors like watermelon, tropical burst, and my favorite, grape. And on the site, you can build a 12 or 24 pack of your own that's delivered right to your door. If you go to 5hourenergy.com, the number 5hourenergy.com, and get a 5 Hour Energy product today, you can use my promo code LOCKEDONCFB to receive 20% off your order. This offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders. Go to 5hourenergy.com today. That is 5hourenergy.com. Visit them today. Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars covering all things BYU. The remainder of this schedule: Baylor, Arizona, Oklahoma State, UCF, a really brutal stretch with that Arizona, Oklahoma State, UCF, Utah. Then you get Kansas, Arizona State, and Houston to finish this thing out. Should the rest of the conference be afraid of BYU as title contenders? And maybe not even the rest of the conference, but the way the rest of this schedule plays out. Let's break that down next. Can the Cougars not just go bowling, but make some serious noise?
Yeah, I think they can. Here's the deal is that you mentioned that stretch. You go Arizona, Oklahoma State, UCF, bye week, and then Utah. That 4-game stretch is really going to determine what I think the whole tenor of what BYU season feels like. If they go out there and lose all 4 of those games, well, suddenly the sheen comes right off of this season, and you're like, wow, well, that kind of died real quick. The other thing is this is a BYU squad that feels like they have got just the whole team bought into what they're doing right now, and I think they're going to compete better against those teams. The good news is you get both Arizona and Oklahoma State at home in back-to-back weeks. And if you can pick off both of those games, then I think the whole, just the sound around Provo is like, hey, this team actually is doing something here in the Big 12 and really proving themselves to be a capable team at the Power 4 level. But I just look at this as the history of Kalani Sitake over the past 4 to 5 years is that October has routinely been the weakest month for BYU. So the 3 games in October, Arizona, Oklahoma State, and UCF, that's going to go a long way to determining if BYU is a contender or truly a pretender.
Do you trust BYU as a contender yet, or is the sample size of 4 games too small?
I still think it's a little bit small. Here's the deal. You can get up for one game in the Big 12 against Kansas State and have the crowd behind you and go out there and ride that wave of momentum to the win that they did. It was an impressive win. There's no doubt about that. But remember, last year, BYU was 3-0 to start the season. They were 4-1 at one point. They were 5-2 at one point, Drake. And then what happened? A 5-game losing streak to end the year. BYU fans, I think, are still being very cautious. They're happy that their team's 4-0, and obviously they're ecstatic that they took down a team the caliber of Kansas State. But I still think you need to take some time here, maybe the next 2 or 3 games. At that point, I think you can sit back and say, okay, this is a team that actually can make a push at this, or it's more of, okay, bowl eligibility, great, and let's see where the season goes from here.
Jake, I texted Spencer McLaughlin of Locked On College Football, and the text read this was 8:30 Saturday. If BYU beats Kansas State, it's a disaster day for the Big 12. Reason being, that's a Big 12 title contender in Kansas State, a school in BYU that many thought wouldn't go to a bowl game. At this point, it's like the movie Santa Claus with Tim Allen. When you kill Santa Claus, you now have to become Santa Claus. If BYU goes 7-5, this loss only hurts the Big 12's odds of getting a team in the at-large for the college football playoff. Is BYU ready to be Santa Claus? Is this imposter syndrome? I mean, how do you assess the assessment that BYU's win means the Cougars have to step up?
Well, I don't think BYU wants to be, you mentioned the Santa Claus. I don't think they want to do that because they have aspirations of doing bigger and better things. This is a team, I'm speaking to players.
Well, being Santa Claus is good here. You want to become Santa Claus.
Okay, sure, good point. Yeah, you want to become Santa Claus. Sorry, you don't want to be the Santa Claus who ended up,
dying.
Yes. You don't want to have that happen. Here's the deal.
Jake, you don't want to be dead Santa Claus.
Yes.
We've narrowed it down to that.
Okay. So the bigger thing for BYU is yes, they want to do some big things this season. The coaches and players have been talking about it all off season long. They've trained hard. They've worked on a lot of the things that they have hoped to improve from last year to be a better team than they are. But you're right. Let's say they do go a 7-5 or an 8-4 even. That is still not going to help the Big 12 because it just so happens that this week you have Kansas State and Oklahoma State playing each other. And one of those teams that was considered to be a contender ahead of the season is now 0-2 out of the gate. And that's going to absolutely cripple any chances of an at-large bid. So yeah, BYU would love to make a run and become one of those teams that can be in the mix there. But if the sheen does come off and they're 7-5 or 8-4, that does hurt the conference as a whole.
I know we've kind of talked negatively about how good BYU is, but I love the fact that from the emotion of Saturday into Sunday, a lot of the shows, myself included, that you're listening to are so high on BYU. It's good on Tuesday to bring the expectations to a level of, hey, 8-4 is still a really good season, though BYU fans have higher aspirations right now. It makes me start to question, is Kalani Sitake, what is he setting himself up for? Right now, the momentum is very high. If BYU goes 7-5 at this point, has it become a disappointment? Is the energy like it was last year, 5-2? Is the energy so high that now you have to keep it? Otherwise, you're going to disappoint a lot of people.
I do think you have to keep it. He's talked about this. He's talking about each game as being a statement. That's the term he started to use for these games. So he mentioned in his press conference this week that Game 5 against Baylor, it's their 5th statement. So he's looking at it as each one of these games has a different message to the rest of the college football universe and the Big 12 as a whole, and even to the team themselves. And they do need to keep the energy up. If you go to Baylor and fall flat on your face, that's going to leave a really bad taste in Cougar fans' mouths because you're going to be on a bye week and then you're going to not be back in action until October 12th against Arizona. And who knows what Arizona looks like at that point. And I just look at this. You can't afford to fall flat on your face at this point. If you do, yeah, it's going to absolutely have a lot of people, Kalani Sitake included, feeling pretty down about how things started and maybe how they finished. But I look at this as a team that they are really intent on going out and showing the world that they're far better than what they were in 2023. And so far, they've proven that. They're 4-0 against all odds. I think most people would have had them 2-2 at best coming into the season.
And that's to maybe make my point a little bit more clear. If BYU had started 2-2, finished 6-6, fans consider that a success. When you start 4-0, you build the idea in fans' heads, we can contend. Yeah. Then you go 6-6, you're looking at a much different 6-6 for the Cougars. Jake, when it comes to that, the emotion, the fan support, the current pomp, circumstance, and fervor for BYU, is this as good as it's been since they joined the Big 12? How does this compare to 5-2 last year, and where do fans sit following the 4-0 start?
I think it's as good as it's been, absolutely, because last year BYU played a decent slate of games. They only went 2-7 in the conference, and that it didn't go the way that any BYU fan wanted it to go. Had they beaten the likes of Oklahoma or maybe in Oklahoma State last year and had gotten that elusive 6th win and gone bowling, maybe the feeling would be a little bit different right now. But the fact you beat one of the bona fide contenders in this league in Kansas State, it's absolutely the best it's been to this point.
I love it. Jake, I need it to keep going. I need BYU to.
And let me add one thing on that. You mentioned the 6-6 thing. I thought BYU going into the season 6-6 was the mark that I thought would be successful for BYU, because remember they were 13th out of 16 teams. So you get to bowl eligibility, that's great. But you mentioned now that they're 4-0, you got to reset expectations. I think right now 8-4 should be the bar BYU is gunning for at this point at minimum, because you start 4-0 and you go 2-6 down the stretch. Ain't nobody going to be happy.
Yeah, and you could argue, hey, well, in those games we played a porous Wyoming team. Well, Houston is right down the schedule. We're going to give you a win against Houston later in the year. So you're already at 5. It's just a matter of picking up wins in those tougher games. And even Kansas now proves to be easier. And what Arizona State could be, and is Arizona easier than expected? I mean, there are more wins shaping up on the schedule than maybe I had imagined for BYU based on where we are now on Tuesday, September 24th. Jake, coming up, the Pac-12 is back. They got Gonzaga, and I know you're big. You cover all things on the west side of the country, and we've talked about Gonzaga as a player in Big 12 expansion. Put on the old KSL hat here. Let's talk some Big 12 expansion on Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. I go to FanDuel and I say, hey, FanDuel, I think BYU is going to beat Kansas State. And so many of you guys are in the comment section saying, oh, this is clickbait and there's no way it's going to happen. And you know what? You don't even have to apologize. You don't have to. Because I went to FanDuel and I said, FanDuel, here's what I think is going to happen. BYU is going to beat Kansas State. And FanDuel said, fine, put some money on it. And I did, and I won. NFL fans, too. You can start with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check on the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you placed your bets. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's right, $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. You can live bet there, check live stats, live play-by-play. So many options and ways to utilize FanDuel, and you can utilize it to bet on the BYU Cougars when you think they're going to win. That's FanDuel.com. Visit them today. Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars. Let's do a little KSL here, too.
Okay.
Big 12 expansion. The talk recently was Gonzaga and the commissioner meeting with UConn and, could you go Washington State and Oregon State? We've now seen the Pac-12 rebuilt. We've now heard rumors that Gonzaga will join that rebuilt Pac-12, and they're looking at an 8-9 team conference to bring football back as well. Is that, with the addition of a Boise State, and could they still possibly get USF because their new grant of rights only has a $2 million penalty for leaving, and USF and Memphis could afford that? Is the Big 12 in a worse spot today now that Gonzaga's signed ink with somebody else?
No, I don't think so. I think Gonzaga, had they wanted to be in the Big 12, knowing what I know of Brett Yormark and him being a hoop head like he is, I think they would have been in the league. That's my personal opinion on the matter. I think Gonzaga likes being a big fish in a small pond. Here's the deal, Drake. They go into this rebuilt Pac-12. Even Utah State, obviously, we're hearing they're going to join. They're joining the league, and obviously that affects us here locally in Salt Lake City because my station, KSL, the KSL Sports Zone, we're the broadcast rights holder for Utah State football and basketball. So they're going to be part of this rebuilt Pac-12. But really, who are the other contenders in basketball for Gonzaga in the Pac-12? It's San Diego State. All the other teams out there, Washington State, Oregon State, none of them are a power player in basketball. So I think it goes more to what I believe about Gonzaga. They love being a big fish in a small pond, and they're very good at it, and they're going to continue to do that even as members of the Pac-12.
What do you make of this conference that has all of a sudden come together overnight in terms of history of college football? It's been like a week, and we've already decided, hey, the Pac-12 exists again. What is your opinion of what's happening out west?
It's weird. I'm not going to lie. The fact that Boise State, Utah State, San Diego State, Fresno, all of them are going to be able to put the Pac logo next to their name. That's a conference that I'm a kid that's born and bred in the Western United States. The Pacific Athletic Conference, the Pac-10, Pac-12, whatever age you are, that brand represented USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington. I mean, nothing negative towards Utah State, Washington State, Oregon State. It just doesn't have the same luster that it once had. But it's good to see that Oregon State and Washington State are making the best of a bad situation. They found themselves up a creek without a paddle, and credit to them. They have found a way to get themselves out of what seeming to be jeopardy. Now, I still think they probably should have combined with the Mountain West and formed a league. That's just my personal opinion on the matter. I know they wanted to keep the Pac branding, so I get all that. So that's why they made the move that they did, and they wanted to not necessarily have to hold on to some of the teams they didn't deem would be big revenue earners in this new league. So you did what you did, but it's so weird to consider. Yeah, the Fresnos, the San Diego States, even up here in Salt Lake City, in Logan, Utah State, they're now a Pac-12 school. And I would have never thought in a million years I'd ever be able to say that statement and have it be true.
When we talk about the old Southwest Conference, it died admirably. It fell on its own sword. You can still remember the great games between Texas and Texas A&M, or Baylor and Texas Tech, and the Big 8 Conference. I mean, when those leagues imploded, you thought, yeah, you saved face because you had the Texas Longhorns and built a reputable brand in college athletics. Is the Pac-12 just tarnishing what it could? Because it could have just gone away. But now it's making this experiment happen without branding. You just joined the Mountain West. It made too much sense in my brain for them to do that. And now they're trying to save the Pac-12. To me, you go from the Conference of Champions to the Conference of Clowns. I don't, and that's harsh, but that's what it's, a hodgepodge of teams that got left behind by everybody else.
Well, here's the deal. BYU was a founding member of the Western Athletic Conference. The WAC had a very strong brand for decades. Remember, Arizona State were founding members of that league where they jumped over to form the Pac-10. Utah, Colorado State, there were a lot of really, really good teams in the WAC. Well, the WAC became unwieldy when they decided to go out and try to be a 16-team league and add the likes of Rice and SMU, and I don't remember who else. Tulsa. Yeah, there we go. Big name brands out there in the Midwest. It got unwieldy. Guess what happened? BYU, Utah, some of these bigger brands, they split away and founded the Mountain West Conference because they realized, you know what, we can't hitch our wagon to what's going on. The WAC essentially died, and it's been rebranded. It originally was a basketball conference. It added some football. Now they're part of the United Athletic Conference. It's just, you mentioned, it's a hodgepodge of teams that are just trying to find the best situation available to them. And I give them credit, but it is a far cry from what the Pac used to be, because the Pac, once again, used to be this jewel of the West Coast. And now, it looks more like a G5 version of what the FCS level WAC is.
I've asked a lot of people this, Jake, and I want your opinion as well. Is this just a way for Washington State and Oregon State to show profitability and eventually move to the ACC or the Big 12 in 5 years? Are they really trying to rebuild the Pac-12 into something, or will they jump at the first sign of more money?
I would imagine they'll jump at the first sign of real money. Here's the deal. I think any of those schools that are joining the Pac, you better keep one eye open, because the first opportunity, any of them, I mean, Boise State, San Diego, any of them get a chance to jump to a league like the Big 12, or in the case of Oregon State and Washington, ACC, etc., they're going to do it. Now, the only way I feel like that they would stay put is, let's say the ACC does blow up and suddenly there's two Bay Area schools that are like, hey, remember us old friends? We want to get back together. If you can get Cal and Stanford back into the league, maybe that keeps it a viable conference and then you build from there. But if I'm any of these new schools joining this league, I am being very wary of any suggestion or rumor of both Oregon State and Washington State potentially jumping, because if they do, that league will fall flat on its face once again.
Speaking of viability, is this a long-term play in general? Can this league keep up with even the AAC?
It's a good question. The bigger concern I've got, Drake, is looking at right now, we're looking at two leagues. Speaking of the new Pac-12 and the Mountain West, both of them currently have 7 football playing members, and you have to have 8 full-time members to be an FBS conference. Which one of these are going to blink first? Or are they going to go and raid the CUSA and grab the likes of New Mexico State, Texas State, UTEP? It's like, okay, how much are you willing to go to, the lengths you're willing to go to keep your league viable? And that's a big question mark I've got right now. Now, if the Mountain West does implode, let's say UNLV, Air Force, UNLV decides to jump into this new Pac-12, Air Force goes to the AAC, well, then the Mountain West falls apart, and maybe you can scoop up one or two more schools, make yourself a 10-team league. But yeah, there's no good option, it feels like, for either one of these leagues, and the long-term viability, yeah, I've got major question marks about both of them.
Is there any way that they're competitive with the AAC? Spencer McLaughlin has talked about how the AAC champion should have a lock on that college football playoff spot, that 12th seed. Is this rebuilt Pac-12 even close to Memphis and USF and those guys?
If they start to play good football once again, I'm talking about the Boise States. Boise State's kind of been a middling program for a little bit here. San Diego State has aspirations of being a top level program. Oregon State and Washington State probably figure they're going to be the big dogs in this new league. Well, unless you can go out and really prove that you are really, really good on the national stage, yeah, the AAC is going to own that free, they call it at large bid. There's at large bid. They're going to own that for the time being. It makes it very clear sense to me that they will be the favorite to hold on to that title for the time being. The Pac-12 has the opportunity to match that, but for the time being, I think it's a decided advantage in the favor of the AAC. If
you're the Big 12, do you care about any of this at all? Is there a reason to keep an eye on what's happening out west?
Not really. I look at it and say, okay, maybe we'll keep an eye on, see if any of these programs really decide to invest at the level that we feel like will make them competitive in our league. You and I have talked about Oregon State and Washington State. I would have brought them into the Big 12 just for travel partners to create a Western wing, but right now, I just don't see it. I think the Big 12 has got bigger aspirations. If the ACC decides to fall apart, now we've heard rumors about them renegotiating their deal and getting some more money for those schools like Florida State. If they pull that off and where the ACC falls apart, yeah, you say thanks, but no thanks. We're looking eastward. We're going to look at the Miamis, the Louisvilles. We're looking at those teams because those are far more attractive options than anything that's in the Pac-12 right now.
Jake, where can folks find more of your work?
Locked On Cougars, wherever you get your podcasts, also on YouTube, just like this show. And obviously you can follow me. You see my X handle down there, Jacob C. Hatch. Also follow the show Locked On Cougars on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter as well.
BYU is good at football again. And we said that at 5-2 last year, but maybe this time it sticks. Thank you very much, Jake.
Thank you.
And for those listening, thank you. Hey, come back tomorrow, and I can guarantee you, myself and Jake both will be talking more football from BYU to Arizona State to Houston and Texas Tech and all things in between. This has been and always will be Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.